Two questions haunt every life, writes Andy Crouch. The first, what are we meant to be? The second, why are we so far from what we're meant to be? Hello and welcome to Restoring the Soul, a podcast dedicated to helping you close the gap from what you're meant to be and what keeps you from being all that. I'm your producer, Brian Beatty, and I want to welcome you to this edition of Restoring the Soul, where we're seeking to answer the question, what if the real struggle behind pornography was actually a deep longing for fullness in Christ? Today's podcast is the conclusion of an encore edition of a conversation Michael had with Lisa TerKeurst titled Therapy and Theology from the Proverbs 31 Ministries podcast. Lisa is president of Proverbs 31 Ministries, and she's New York Times bestselling author of It's Not Supposed to Be This Way. Proverbs 31 Ministries is a non-denominational, non-profit Christian ministry that seeks to lead women into a personal relationship with Christ, with Proverbs 31, 10-31 as a guide. In this conversation, Lysa and Michael, along with Meredith Brock, introduce us to the 6 broken promises of pornography. No matter your stage of life, we recommend listening with an open mind and open heart to gain a better understanding on how to support a spouse, friend, or loved one who may be facing this challenge. Now, without any more delay, here's Lisa TerKeurst and Meredith Brock.
I'm really excited to once again have Michael joining me. I know usually you hear from Jim Kress, who is one of my counselors that I worked with when my life fell apart at the seams and we were having really extreme marriage issues. So I worked with Jim Kress a lot personally, but Michael Cusick was the marriage counselor that worked with myself and Art through a lot of our struggles. And our struggles were in this same vein. For those of you who know my testimony and who know what my family and I walked through, part of it was my husband's unfaithfulness and then us working really hard to heal from that, not knowing if we were going to be able to come back together and reconcile or not, but being very committed to restoring our relationship with God. And then God did do a miracle and he brought us back together. But I think so many people are struggling in their marriage that pornography is something that is a huge issue and not very many people are talking about it, and we often don't know how to talk about it. It feels very comfortable. I want to acknowledge we certainly have singles listening to us today. I still think this information is going to be incredibly helpful for you. I also want to say that if you are married, it would be great to listen to this podcast together. Today, I want to talk about how barriers built by a porn addiction can really become a bridge to abundant life. I'm pulling that verbiage from Michael's book that he wrote that I think is incredibly helpful, Surfing for God, Discovering the Divine Desire Beneath Sexual Struggle. And yesterday, Meredith, when you were talking about the book title, you made a slip in the verbiage there, but I think it's actually pretty profound. You said the driving desire beneath sexual struggle. And I do think that's a misconception that Michael's book certainly addresses and the podcast episode before this one addressed, and that is the pornography struggle is less about the driving desire of the sexual struggle and more about the divine desire to find the road to abundant life, to get that deep thirst down inside of us answered by God himself. And that can seem kind of confusing. So, Michael, I want to jump right in with you first. I do want to get to how do we talk about this, but first, let's talk about these issues, the 5 broken promises of porn.
Yeah, that would be great. And I have a friend who actually emailed me 2 weeks ago. And in my book, it says the 5 broken promises of porn, and there's actually 6 in the book. So whenever there's a redo, I'm going to make sure that I check that out. But each of these promises are really a way that, in this case of this discussion, pornography offers us something. It draws us to something, and it makes a promise in the same way that I have a love-hate relationship with Reese's Cups or M&Ms when I go to the grocery store to pick up a gallon of juice. And if it's late in the evening and I'm kind of tired, those Reese's Cups promise me a sense of fullness where I might be empty, a little jolt of sugar where I might be tired, just a little sweet treat when I'm feeling sorry for myself. But the problem isn't that I just eat one or even one package, but I go for the 3 for 99-cent deal. And in my car, I take all of those wrappers and I stuff them under the seat so that nobody finds them. And so it's the same dynamic where in the Garden of Eden, the fruit was pleasing to the eye and desirable. And the fruit really offered this promise, which was something very different than what God was saying. And so the first of these is that in this case, as we're speaking of men, when a man looks at pornography, the promise is to validate his manhood without requiring strength. And I have often asked men when they're in my office, where in your life do you typically feel the strongest as a man? And they might go down the list of, well, leading my kids' team, or when I'm with guys out backpacking, or most frequently probably is at work. And in many, many, many years of counseling, I've never had a man in his first, second, or third answer say, oh, I feel the strongest with my wife. And that's because manhood and masculinity, biblically, I believe, always involves some kind of stepping up where there's a potential risk. And pornography allows a man to be validated by the image that, of course, is an illusion without having to be strong. And my friend John Eldredge said it this way in his book, Wild at Heart, that the reason why porn is the most addictive thing in the universe is because it allows a man to feel like a real man without requiring him to be a real man.
That's really powerful. And, when we're talking about a subject like this, I think I said it yesterday, and I'll say it again today, that there is so much fear of the unknown, especially in the area of pornography, because it does feel so personal to a woman. If her husband is struggling with pornography, or if her boyfriend is struggling with pornography, it feels so personal that if I looked better, then he surely wouldn't struggle with this. And so it's set up to be almost like the perfect storm, because when a woman is afraid and she discovers maybe her husband is looking at pornography and she catches him, the very thing that her fear speaks into his heart is probably the opposite of what he needs to hear in that moment. Wow. And so it feeds that cycle of shame. And the more afraid she feels and the more ashamed he feels, the more distance there's going to be created in that relationship. And pornography comes in and, offers to ease the ache of what's missing in a man's life. And so it's no wonder to me that porn makes such big promises. So what are these promises of porn, Michael?
Yeah, I'll address the second one, but I want to respond, Lisa, to something you just said. And I think as a man, it's important for me to say this to women, that 100% of the time, it is never about a wife or a woman, and it's never really about sex. It's about something so much deeper. It's about these promises. And so as a wife might respond with that fear or what's wrong with me or why wasn't enough, it's never about you. This is about something deeply broken within a man, of him mishandling his pain, or about, as we've been talking about, this deep longing for something that the wife can't provide, that needs to come from his relationship with the Lord.
And let me say something really quick, Michael, because I think this is interesting. If there is a wife out there and she thinks, yeah, but my situation's the exception, what would you say to her? Because I think women are so entrenched in the belief it is about them and it is about sex that when they hear you say that, they may quickly excuse their situation as being the exception to what you just said.
Well, if I had a conversation with that person, I would say, well, tell me what you mean. And that might often come from core beliefs within that woman that don't align with what God says about her and about the very nature of marriage and intimacy. But again, back to this very first promise that porn says you can be a man and you're validated as a man without strength, that just points the light right at the idea that man doesn't feel like he's enough. Somebody said that it's not the shouting of the voice that causes men to go to pornography compulsively. It's the whispering of the lie. And the lie is not just about the object that this will satisfy you and or feel good. The lie is you are not enough. You are not enough to move toward your wife. You are not enough in terms of being desirable. And that's really both a wound and a lie within the man. So I think that the overall process then of allowing that woman to engage with her own story and with her own heart to look at what it is that she feels like she's the exception.
And that gets into fullness in Christ for her.
Absolutely.
Which we've done many episodes on topics that really will address that.
That's
so
right.
Let's keep going to the second lie around pornography.
Yeah, the second lie is a promise that pornography can offer sexual fulfillment without relationship. And this idea is somewhat intuitive, but when I was writing the book, Surfing for God, there was a billboard at a major intersection in Denver that advertised for porn DVDs at a local, quote unquote, exotic bookstore. And the sign said 99-cent DVDs, cheaper than dating. And
Wow.
my jaw dropped. Even though I had been involved in that world as a sex addict, my jaw dropped in that it was so blatant that you don't need a relationship. And, why spend $1 on dating if you can get your desires fulfilled for 99 cents? And I do think that this deep longing in the heart and this longing for connection and transcendence and safety and having our needs met in this beautiful way that God designed, that is something that is indestructible, but because of our pain, because of the emptiness, because of the lies we believe, we all find a way to try to meet that need within ourselves without having to be vulnerable and trusting before God. So there's this ambivalence of I was created for relationship and I long for it, and yet relationship might be something that is too vulnerable, too scary. I may have too many wounds from the past.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That billboard is so disturbing to me.
It's sad.
It
Breaks my
is.
heart.
But, that's a perfect example of exactly what you're talking about with that second broken promise of pornography. So what is number 3?
Number 3 is that porn promises intimacy without risk and suffering. And when I'm talking about intimacy, I'm specifically referring to the biblical idea of being known. Intimacy is not just about emotional connection or history together or even physicality, but it's really about being deeply known. The Psalm 139 idea that everything inside me and everything about me is known. And in the midst of that, my Father, my God, lays his hand upon me, which is a picture of pronouncing favor and blessing and sonship. And so all intimacy and being known bears the potential of being hurt, of suffering, of being abandoned, of being rejected, of being misunderstood. And yet it's the thing that we long for the most deeply. And so just as a parenthesis, this is one of the most important pieces of conversation when a man begins to really deal with this in counseling or even in conversation with his wife. And that's beginning to really be intentional about what is intimacy. A lot of times premarital counseling or other resources will help people to think about what is a good marriage, but we oftentimes don't really have any kind of a working definition of intimacy. So that's an important point. The next promise is
Well,
that,
Michael, hang on one second. Let me ask you a question, because I think if I'm listening to this, I am waking up to the idea that my words as a wife are impacting my husband more than probably what I even realize. And I think that for a long time, I felt like I was the emotional one in the relationship who needed words of affirmation, and Art was the secure one in the relationship who just needed practical things. But I am understanding more and more that he also needs words spoken to him that make him feel safe enough for the intimacy to occur. And I'm not even talking sexual intimacy. I'm just talking relational intimacy here. And so are there some statements, maybe one or two, that are intimacy killers in a relationship? And then are there statements that we could say to the men in our life or to our husband that foster that sense of intimacy as defined in a man's mind?
Well, I'll take the second question first because I think intimacy killers can be somewhat individualized. But one of the best questions that when I do our men's weekends around Surfing for God or when I work with a man, and even in my circle of friends, is we connect with one another instead of saying, if we haven't seen each other for a week and we're getting together for breakfast, instead of going, hey, how you doing? Or how's your week? We say, how's your heart? How's your heart? And the first couple of times we do that, a man will go, well, I had my physical a year ago. My cholesterol was pretty good. But the reality is the heart is central. And Jesus spoke a lot about it. And, of course, his sermon in response to the Pharisees is that sexual immorality and adultery and lust and murder and anger, those don't come from outside of us. In other words, it's not the object of temptation. It's something that comes from inside of us. And even the verse in Proverbs 4 that says, guard your heart for a wellspring of life, because it's a wellspring of life, that's often understood as, your heart is bad and you need to really be careful and press it down. But we have new hearts, and the new covenant has occurred, and our heart of stone has turned to a heart of flesh. And I like to think of Proverbs 4 of guarding your heart as a sentry standing in front of a door of a museum, and there is a precious, precious treasure inside. And the guarding is that you don't want the enemy to come and steal, kill, and destroy that treasure. And it's, as we talked about in the last episode or conversation, it's not about it's bad and I have to suppress it, but rather it's good and I want to fan the flames. There's emptiness and I want there to be fullness. So questions about the internal world and helping us to pay attention. I think as men, we need that. I know that I need that. Even though I'm a counselor and I kind of live in the internal world by day, it's easy for me to shut that off. And I call that just the discipline of attentiveness to our soul and our inner life.
That's so good. And I know that some relationship killer examples could be if you start to recognize that maybe your husband's struggling with this, some of those things like, how could you? And
saying those kind of phrases.
Like, how could you do this to me?
Yeah.
How could you do this to our family? Don't you realize what?
Why can't you just stop?
Yeah. Why can't you just stop? Some of those things, because honestly, I don't know that A, the man would have an answer for that, and B, I think emotionally it just causes him to further disconnect.
And he's probably wondering the same thing.
Yeah. And so
yes, exactly.
This is such helpful information, Michael. Okay, number 4.
Number 4 is that porn promises passion and life without connecting to the soul. We were meant to live from the inside out, and Jesus refers to the inmost being, and Paul refers to it in Philippians 3, that we'd be rooted and established in love in our inmost being. Psalm 139, that God knit us together and created our inmost being. And I could go on and on and on. And this is the part inside of us that is our truest self and where spirit is and the Spirit of God. And it's meant to be vital and enlivened and blooming and generative. And it's what we connect to. We say, this is life with a capital L. And because sex is physiological and because it's so woven into our body and our neurology, that if a man is experiencing boredom, or if he is tired or depressed, or if he is disconnected from relationships, pornography will send rushes of dopamine and other chemicals from the brain through the body that will literally awaken and enliven. And for many men, long before they ever look at an image on their smartphone or their laptop, it's the ritual of thinking about doing that, or the idea of an image might pop into their mind unwanted, and that will create a surge of chemicals. And so it really creates a sense of aliveness. And many men use or look at pornography because it's like the hit that they get every day just to be able to make it through the day. There's a very tragic but true line in the 20 years or so ago, there was the Academy Award winning movie American Beauty, and the main character in there is in the shower and speaks of sexually gratifying himself, and he says it's all downhill from here. And his life was so empty that was the high point of his day. And the tragic part is that he was married to a lovely woman. And so the idea of connecting to have life be infused into his heart wasn't even an idea. It was, I'm alone.
Wow, that's really sad.
It is, but
tragic.
I can see. I mean, these. That's why these are the empty promises.
Lies.
They're
right.
lies.
Yeah.
All right, number 5, Michael.
Number 5 is that porn promises comfort and care without having to depend on others. And this is usually not an intentional or malicious thing where a man wakes up in the morning saying, I don't want to depend on others, but it's often just part of his story where a core belief formed inside of him through experience that I can't get my needs met by depending on others. And I'll never forget working with a young pastor who had a large, quickly growing church. And he, all throughout seminary, tried to overcome what he identified as a serious porn addiction. And as I asked him to tell me his story, rather than me just giving him tools to stop, he explained that he had a single mom who did her best to provide, and she worked long hours. And he was the classic latchkey kid who would come home, do his homework, feed himself, and then he was alone. And though the mom did a great job of kind of locking down the inappropriate material, back then he would turn on one of the pay channels and he couldn't see anything, but through the white static and fuzz on the screen, he could hear sexual acts happening. And to him, he wouldn't sexually stimulate himself. He would just lay there and listen to that. And it provided a kind of comfort and care for legitimate needs inside of him. But obviously it was a context that was confusing and ultimately unhealthy. So when a man grows up or experiences a world or a family of origin where the needs for being seen and soothed and safe and secure are not met, he will try to meet those within his own power because he has no other strategy for doing that.
Wow. This is so fascinating to me, but also at the same time, parts of it feel daunting because
really big.
It feels really big. And I'm just so thankful, Michael, you're able to unpack some of these. And I know we originally said 5, but you said there's actually 6. So what is the last one?
The 6th one is about power. My mentor, Dan Allender, who is an expert in the area of lust and sexual brokenness and sexual abuse, would always refer to the Sermon on the Mount, and he would say that all addictions and all compulsive behavior come down to either relief or revenge. And where he took that from was Jesus, he redefined and spoke of adultery as an issue of the heart, and he spoke of murder as an issue of the heart. And so far, all of the promises or the broken promises that I'm speaking about are really issues of relief for an emptiness and a deep need inside. And the last broken promise is that there is a promise of power over women without humility and responsibility. In other words, I can consume I can treat in any way I like. This is all about the gratification of my needs, and I will be powerful, but without being there to give, to serve, to bless. And of course, we've seen this in our culture over the last few years, where the depth and the pervasiveness of men's power gone awry, especially to exploit, harass, and harm and denigrate women. We're just beginning to peel back the surface of that. But it begins with this sense of making a woman pay for not validating his manhood, or for requiring him to actually be a man who engages as a man and not as a child.
Wow. These are also eye-opening, and I know these are written about in your book, Surfing for God, Discovering the Divine Desire Beneath Sexual Struggle. So I definitely cannot recommend this book enough. I think it is eye-opening and fits right in line with bringing together therapy and theology and unpacking this from a deeper needs and the desire to have a fullness in God that maybe you've never thought about in the context of the discussions around pornography. Michael, as we end today, I want to just make sure that we equip whatever conversations may need to happen now, because you've given us so much good information. But if I'm listening to this and now I want to have a conversation with my husband, how do I even do this? What's the best way to even engage in opening what could feel like Pandora's box around an issue that the woman feels afraid of and the man could feel ashamed of? And that just seems like a potential recipe for a disastrous conversation.
That's such an important question, and let me frame that with John 8, where Jesus said, if you're my disciples, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And of course, Jesus is referring to the truth of the kingdom and who his Father is, and what we now have as the scriptures. But there's also a flip side to that truth, and that's the truth of our own lives and the truth of our own stories. So I just want to affirm that any woman who does want to talk about it, that is wonderful. That is a spiritual act of obedience. That is not a woman being contentious. That's not stirring up trouble. That is a spiritual act of obedience to say from her heart to his, I want more and I want connection. And the starting point would be that it's a talk about the relationship, and that it's a talk really about pain inside. Because to understand what I write about in my book, that it's pain of some kind, emptiness, brokenness, lies that we believe. It's pain that is driving a man to do this. And then, of course, that betrayal and that breaking of trust and the pain inside of the wife's heart, when that pain can be mutually shared, that can be a very, very powerful thing. I think it's also important to remember that many women are affected by the discovery, or when it's disclosed to them about their husband's porn use or sexual struggle, that this taps into lifelong historical pain and wounds. And when that happens, it's often the case where a simple talk will not suffice, because that's when the pain can be overwhelming, and even where a woman can be preoccupied by that pain because it's just in her body. And she might try to pray or read her Bible more or try to hold it together. But in reality, the body is keeping the score, and it's the brain that's saying, this doesn't feel safe. And so it's so important to talk about the present, but also to be able to look at the past. And that's where counseling can really come in. I think the biggest question is, where is it in our marriage where we are vulnerable to mishandling our pain? Where is it in our marriage, in our relationship, where we're missing out on connection? And God speaks of oneness. And of course, this is not a scripture, but you can think of a triangle where at the base of the triangle, there's emotional oneness, where there's just a free sharing of one another's hearts. There's a spiritual level of oneness that's above that, because that spiritual intimacy is just deeper than emotional connection. And then at the top of that triangle is physical oneness. And God's design is for the spiritual and physical to be built on top in a sequential way. And what happens with porn and other sexual sin is that we focus on the physical intimacy, often at the expense of the emotional and spiritual connection. So the question of what is intimacy? It's very common where I'll have a couple in my office and I ask the husband first, rate your marriage on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of how intimate it is. And even though there's a problem that they've come for, the husband will often say 7 or 8. And then I turn to the wife and she's got her lips pursed and partly smiling and partly saying, this always happens. I say, rate your level of intimacy on a scale of 1 to 10. And it's 2 to 3. And the reason is because men tend to define intimacy as the absence of conflict and the presence of sexual intimacy. Women, and I'm a man, so this would have to be confirmed by you all, but women tend to define intimacy based on the presence of something, the presence of connection, the presence of being known, the presence of being heard and understood and validated. And so men need to ask the question, well, what is it that needs to be present? And the answer to that is you. I need to learn to be emotionally present and to bring my heart to the spiritual connection. And it's so easy to make the physical just about that. Going back to Peterson's paraphrase in 1 Corinthians 6, that sex is more than mere skin on skin, but as much spiritual mystery as physical fact.
Wow.
Well, and I know just in my own relationship, when we have had to have so many hard conversations as we've walked the healing journey that we've had to walk, there are some phrases that seem to help build up the relational intimacy and safety within our relationship. And Michael, I'm sure that at some point in the long journey that you have walked with me and with Art, maybe you even taught us this, but when we would go into your office and we would check in, it wasn't how are you doing, but like you said earlier, how is your heart? Where is your heart? And that seemed to be such a good way to check in with each other. And you even encourage us to have regular check-ins where we hit the pause button on life. And instead of jumping to watch a movie or jumping into, doing some activity, that we really hit the pause button on life and did regular check-ins with people. And another phrase that I found very, very helpful, instead of how could you or why would you do that, it's help me understand. That's a way to ease in, and it automatically says in the context of our harder conversations, you're safe and I truly want to hear from you. I'm not looking to weaponize what you're about to say against you. And that phraseology is very helpful. As we end today, is there any other phraseology that you could equip us with?
Yeah, I love what you said about the questioning, because intimacy is absolutely impossible without safety on both sides. And I don't know if you remember, because I don't always do this, but an acronym that I use for checking in, and couples can do this with themselves, is the acronym PRES, as in President or Presbyterian, P-R-E-S. The P stands for physical. How am I doing physical? In addictions, they talk about being hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And those are all physical sensations and aspects. The R is relational. How are we doing? How's our connection? And again, not, did we overcome a fight, but how connected do we feel emotionally and spiritually? The E is just emotional, mad, sad, glad, scared, or some variation of that. And then spiritual, which is not per se, did you have a quiet time today? But how connected do you feel by God? How known do you feel by God? For me, one of the best indicators of my relationship with God is how aware of his presence am I, and to what degree do I feel like I'm plugged into him? And this process of just going back and forth with physical, relational, emotional, spiritual can be a way of deepening intimacy and for the man or woman that has less language for their inner world, it's just a way of being able to develop that. Just like, going from visiting a foreign country where you have a couple of phrases to being able to actually navigate your way around.
Those are all so helpful, and you did teach us that, and I love all of that because I think sometimes when people say, you need to connect heart to heart, you need to connect an intimate conversation without handles to know exactly how to do that, that can feel even like a daunting task. But I think all of this that you've shared today will really help equip us. So, Michael, I know some people are going to be able to talk about this. They're going to be able to read your book. They're going to be able to listen to this podcast. It's going to equip them really well. But then other people are going to need to find a counselor. And so I know you have a ministry that is set up to help people called Restoring the Soul Ministries. How can people find out more about the counseling that you offer?
Our website is restoringthesoul.com, and that talks about our intensive counseling programs here in Colorado. They're 1 and 2 week programs. We work about 50 to 60% with people in ministry and in Christian leadership, but we also work with people outside of that as well. But there are programs where people come to Colorado for extended periods of time.
So thank you for listening to another episode of Restoring the Soul. We want you to know that Restoring the Soul is so much more than a podcast. What we're all about is helping couples and individuals get unstuck. You know how some people go to counseling or marriage therapy for months or even years and never really get anywhere? Our intensive programs help clients get unstuck in as little as 2 weeks. To learn more, visit restoringthesoul.com. That's restoringthesoul.com.